Hello, hello, and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to talk about a reading initiative that I am going to be participating in 2023, and I hope you will come along and participate with me. It is the 2023 Queer TBR Tackle. In this video, I'm going to talk about what that is, sort of the format of it, and what books Jen the librarian and I have selected for our lists for the TBR Tackle. And obviously that means that this is something I am doing in collaboration with Jen the librarian. I will have a link to her channel down below if you would like to check it out. I recommend it if you haven't because it's a delight. And I did a read along with her last year. It was the LGBTQ plus in translation read along, and this is sort of an evolution of that. So let's talk about that first. If you follow along, and if you're new, hello. I've actually gotten a lot of new subscribers recently because there's a lot of like year-end stuff. So a lot of people have joined in. So if you're new, I read a lot of LGBTQ plus books. So does Jen. And she had come up with the idea that she wanted to read more books from different parts of the world that reflected the LGBTQ plus experience. And as such, she started the LGBTQ plus in translation read along, and I ended up sort of co-hosting with her. And during that process, we selected books from all over the world that were LGBTQ plus in nature and which had been in translation. And for a couple of reasons, as we were talking, we decided to change the format and the structure of that a little bit. The first thing is that both Jen and I ended up having a sort of stressful 2022, and there were some changes to her life, and there were nearly some changes to my life that would have made it a little bit more difficult to do something like that, where you constantly need to buy new books or find editions of them to read for various reasons. Constantly purchasing new books wasn't something that was looking very feasible for both of us. And also, we periodically felt bad when people would comment and mention that they had a hard time finding access to a copy of a book. We wanted to continue the conversation because we really gathered a great group of people on the Discord server, which is hosted by Jen. I'll have a link to it down below. The Queer TBR Tackle will live in her server. So if you go down there and join the server, you will be where you need to be. So I recommend checking that out in the description box down below. But we really got a great group of people, and this is a casual read along. That's another benefit of it that I would say. I am someone who struggles with the idea of like a TBR because I'm a mood reader. I might set myself a list of books that I want to read, and then I might change my mind, or I might not be in the mood to read it when it comes around to that time. So I prefer a low stress approach. I prefer to allow myself some flexibility to change my mind or read something else, and things like that. So I really appreciated how low pressure this is. People would skip a book if they didn't have access to it or didn't feel like reading it, and then they would jump in on the books that they really did want to read. And that was fun. We got a great group of people who really added a lot to the conversation, and we wanted to keep that going. Another facet of it is that we struggled a little bit because sometimes you will have an author who is from a different area, like not North America, not Europe, but they write their books in English. And because their books are published in English, they did not qualify for the LGBTQ plus in translation read along because it has to be in translation in order to qualify. So we just wanted to get out of that in translation area. You also fall into some tricky things where sometimes you will have an author who is from another area, but they're, for instance, maybe an author was born in Africa, moved to Paris. The book is in translation because it was published in French, but it takes place in France. And suddenly you're in a minefield of areas like, you know, how much does this qualify or not qualify? So if you take the in translation aspect away, you still get to focus on queer authors. We also really struggled with terminology a lot because there were people who struggled with the idea if you don't add the plus at the end of LGBTQ plus and things like that. So we had a lot of conversation about what to call this new version of it, and we decided to call it the Queer TBR Tackle. Queer is a difficult word. it has historically been used as a slur, although you'd be really hard-pressed to find a word to describe a part of the gay community that has not been used as a slur at some point. So there are tricky connotations that come with the word. A lot of people who grew up before the year 2000 have negative connotations with the word. I am one of those people. However, it is a really easy word to use to describe the entire LGBTQ plus community. And it's not to diminish the different aspects of the community. It's not to try to omit anyone. It's because it seems like the easiest word to use to encompass everybody and all of the different experiences. And that is something that we are kind of hoping to do. You might not find representations of everything in the books that we have chosen. I have my pile here, but we want to honor that. So we really struggled with wording a lot. Hopefully this is the best, most inclusive terminology that we can use. If the word queer is a trigger for you, I apologize, but there's really not much else that we can do. Basically, in reformatting the LGBTQ plus read-along into the Queer TBR Tackle, one thing that Jen and I really talked about was how we can make a sort of read-along format accessible for a lot of people. And we started thinking about reading from the books that we already have on our shelves and using those, because that is something that has been sort of a growing conversation throughout 2022, and it is something that we've heard a lot of people saying that they are going to do in 2023. They're going to do a sort of TBR tackle, focus on the books that they have in their library that they have not already read, and try to emphasize those books in 2023. So we decided that's a perfect format for what we want to do with this sort of emphasis on queer writers. So we decided we would do a queer version of the TBR Tackle, and Jen picked 3 books that have been on her TBR for the longest. I picked 3 books that have been on my TBR the longest. The really interesting thing about Jen and I collaborating on this is that one of the books that she chose, her 3 books first and sent them to me, and one of her 3 books is actually would have been one of mine if I had picked first, because it's been on my TBR for the longest. And another one of her books, I think my TBR is a lot older than Jen's. My selections go back a lot further than hers do. I don't know what that says about me, that I have had these on my TBR for a very long time, and I haven't gotten to them yet. And one of her oldest is from the time that I've been on book 2, because it's on her TBR because I mentioned it in a video, and it is on mine as well. But we'll talk about the books in a second. So anyway, she chose 3. I chose 3. We sort of divided those 6 books up, went back and forth. So there would be a pick from me, a pick from her, and gave a gap month in between. And what that gap month does is if it adds to the low pressure quality a little bit. So if you don't read the book in the month that we're kind of assigning it, if you want to call it assigning, you have another month to catch up to it, or you could read it later in the year. It's fine. The other thing that we're kind of hoping we can do with that gap between books that we have selected is we want to invite other people to create their own Queer TBR Tackle lists. So if you have a channel, you can do your own video where you talk about the queer books that you have on your shelf that you would like to read in 2023. You can pick as many or as little as you would like. We're not putting any restrictions on people. If you want to pick 1 book for every remaining month in the year, we're a little late for January, but if you want to do January, that's totally up to you. You can pick 12 books, 1 for every month. You can do every other month like we did. You can pick 2 books, whatever you want to do. So you can create a video. If you don't have a channel and you've been thinking about creating a channel, this would be a great opportunity to do that. You could post this on Instagram and tag either Jen or I or both, or use the hashtag Queer TBR Tackle. That will help us find your posts as well, because we definitely want to emphasize the TBR Tackle and the spirit of the TBR Tackle, where this is about books that you own and have wanted to read for a long time, but we want to give other people the opportunity to create those lists. And I think Jen and I both really love discovering other queer books and other queer authors, and so there's an element of fascination that we have about what might be on your list, what you have been wanting to tackle. Maybe will help us discover books that we didn't know about, or maybe make us rethink a book that we hadn't planned on reading, something like that. basically, you could have an opportunity to add to our TBR. I don't actually like the term TBR anymore. I prefer pile of possibilities, and that's kind of how I'm thinking about all of this. So if you want to participate, you can read as many or as few of the books that we have chosen as possible. You can read as many or as few of the books that you choose, and we reserve the right to do the same. That's the basic structure of this. Again, I will have a link to Jen's Discord server down below. I'll have a link to her channel down below, so feel free to check both of those out. So now let's talk about the books and the sort of schedule that we have set up for the year. I think we have a good mix of titles that will be accessible to a lot of people. Maybe you already have them on your shelf. I think odds are pretty good for at least half of these books that you may already own a copy, you may have already read this book before, or odds are pretty good your library will have a copy if you would like to sort of jump in, but you don't own a copy. So I think we have a pretty good mix of titles that you have probably heard of, maybe want to read on your own, and maybe something you haven't heard of and might have to seek out. But I think it sort of naturally turned out to be a list of books that should be fairly accessible for all people. And I think that's really great because that is something that was a big concern to us when we were doing the LGBTQ+ in translation read along. So it just sort of happened this way. So the first book that is on the schedule for us is for February, because again, it took us a little while to figure out what we wanted to do and what format we wanted to be in. Part of it is because I was sick for a large part of December, and then the holidays happened, so we didn't really start finalizing details until January. So we're going to give you a pass on the month of January, unless, as I said, you want to create your own TBR Tackle list. And again, if you do, we would love to see what is on your list, and if you want to include January. But we are going to pick up with February. And the only real order that we decided to impose on this list is, first of all, we decided to alternate back and forth between a pick from me and then a pick from Jen. And we tried to, since February is not that far away, we tried to start with the book that is most likely to be accessible to a lot of people, and that is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. So this was one of my picks for the list. And I originally purchased a copy of this paperback when it was released in paperback in the United States, which I believe was 2002. Yes, it is copyright 2002. So possibly 2003, since it was the paperback that I purchased a copy of. So this book has been on my TBR for 20 years, and I never got around to reading it. Part of that is because I moved a fair amount in the first 10 years since after I heard of this book. And somewhere along the way, my copy of it disappeared. So there were a bunch of years in the middle where I didn't have a copy anymore. And I eventually found this used copy a couple of years ago and brought it back into my library, and I still haven't gotten around to reading it. However, this feels like a book that a lot of people will have access to, may already own. Your library is likely to have a copy, whether you are in the North America or in Europe. If you're in other areas, it might be a little more difficult, and I apologize. But I think most people who would be following along are likely to be in either North America or Europe. So it shouldn't be an issue. Jen has actually already read this book, but she loves it and is hoping to reread it. So that actually kind of is fun as well. And I think that is probably the case for a lot of people, because if you have read Fingersmith, odds are pretty good as well that you might want to reread it with a group of people and have some discussion about it. And that seems really fun. So if you're unfamiliar with this, I have the blurbs for each of the books in front of me, and I will read a short blurb about it. So, raised by a loving family of thieves, orphan Sue Trinder is sheltered from the worst of the Victorian underworld until it becomes her turn to make the clan's fortune. She must help a professional rogue named Gentleman marry an heiress and then steal the girl's inheritance by declaring her insane. She wants to please everyone, but as she's confronted with the seemingly helpless victim, Maud, she begins to have her doubts. And I believe there's a sort of sapphic relationship that develops there. I don't know if that's a spoiler or not, because I'm aware that it happens in the book and I've never read it before. I have read a Sarah Waters book. I read The Paying Guests because a couple of years ago I decided I really wanted to read one of her books. So I looked for what would be available to me on audio, and the only one that was The Paying Guests. So I enjoyed it. But if you're a fan of Sarah Waters, it seems that people who are fans of her say that that's not the best one. So I started with one that I liked, but now I'm really eager to get to one of the ones that people have pointed to as a favorite. And this is certainly one of the books that has been on my TBR, or my pile of possibilities, for the longest. Again, I've wanted to read it for 20 years at this point, and I just haven't. So I'm really excited to finally get around to doing that. From there, we take the month of March off and we pick up again in April. And this is the book that Jen selected that would have been on my list of queer books that have been on my TBR for the longest. But again, because Jen chose first and it was on her list, I was able to omit it from my list and pick something else. It's City of Night by John Rechy. So this is a book that Jen and I both had in common. This is a queer classic. And I first heard about it somewhere around 2006 or 2007. I didn't own a copy of it until somewhere in the last 5 years. I believe Joel and I went to Seattle, and I got my copy from Elliott Bay in Seattle. And I wanted to read it. I wanted to read it before I actually owned a copy. I've just never gotten around to reading it. This is a large book, but again, this is a low pressure readathon or TBR tackle. So if you want to read this and you take a little extra time, that is totally fine. Let's see how long it is. It looks like there's an author interview in the back that takes it to 491 pages. Let's see. Oh, it looks like there are some images from the manuscript of the book in my edition. That's pretty cool. So the book itself is 460 pages. It's a chunky little fellow. But I'm really looking forward to this. I've wanted to read it for a very long time, and apparently so has Jen. Here is the description of it. When John Rechy's explosive first novel appeared in 1963, it marked a radical departure in fiction and gave voice to a subculture that had never before been revealed with such acuity. It earned comparisons to Guinea and Kerouac, even as Rechy was personally attacked by scandalized reviewers. Nevertheless, the book became an international bestseller, and 50 years later, it has become a classic. Bold and inventive in style, Rechy is unflinching in his portrayal of one hustling young man and his search for self-knowledge within the neon-lit world of hustlers, drag queens, and the denizens of their world as he moves from El Paso to Times Square, from Pershing Square to the French Quarter. I'm really looking forward to this. I think the fact that it is such a large book and the fact that it is described as a little bit experimental in style is what has kept me away from this, but I'm really glad that I'm finally getting the kick in the pants that I clearly need to read City of Night by John Rechy. So again, that is the book for April, and then we're going to take May off, and we'll pick up in June with a selection from me, which is Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. Before I talk about the book itself, I want to briefly mention pronouns, because Leslie Feinberg's pronoun situation is wildly interesting. There's even a section on Leslie Feinberg's Wikipedia page about pronoun usage. Let me quickly read that to you. Feinberg stated in a 2006 interview that her pronouns varied depending on context. Quote, "For me, pronouns are always placed within context. I am female-bodied, I am a butch lesbian, a transgender lesbian. Referring to me as she, her is appropriate, particularly in a non-trans setting in which referring to me as he would appear to resolve the social contradiction between my birth sex and gender expression and render my transgender expression invisible. I like the gender-neutral pronoun Z or her, HIR, because it makes it impossible to hold onto gender or sex or sexuality assumptions about a person you're about to meet or you've just met. And in an all-trans setting, referring to me as he, him honors my gender expression in the same way that referring to my sister drag queens as she, her does." So to Leslie Feinberg, what pronoun you should use really depended on the context of the environment and how well you knew Leslie Feinberg. Feinberg's widow wrote in her statement regarding Feinberg's death that Feinberg did not really care which pronouns a person used to address her. She preferred to use pronouns she or Z and her or her, HIR, for herself, but also said, "I care which pronoun is used, but people have been respectful to me with the wrong pronoun and disrespectful with the right one. It matters whether someone is using the pronoun as a bigot or if they are trying to demonstrate respect." So Leslie Feinberg's preferred pronoun is like literally every pronoun out there. And if you go on Leslie Feinberg's website, they use different pronouns on different pages. On the Wikipedia page, they refer to Leslie Feinberg as her. So if you hear Jen or I using her or they or he, go with it. Because there is no correct answer, apparently, about which pronoun you should use, and it just makes it difficult. I would love it if there was a clear answer for what pronoun to use. There is not. And as a result, I feel like I am going to try to just say Leslie Feinberg as much as possible because I want to be respectful. And apparently that is what mattered the most to Leslie Feinberg. But yeah, so it sort of is. Leslie Feinberg was writing in a space where Leslie Feinberg is sort of credited with being an early transgender activist. The writing of Leslie Feinberg really specifically deals with gender identity and gender expression. And Leslie Feinberg is sort of a pioneer in that area, which is one of the reasons why this seems like such an important book. This is the most recent book that is on my long-term TBR for this TBR tackle. I have only known about it for a couple of years at this point. So the other interesting thing about this book, before we get to the blurb, which has a very shiny cover, I'm trying to hold it in a place where you can see it without getting a lot of glare from the lights that I have here. The other interesting to note is that Leslie Feinberg wanted Stone Butch Blues to be widely available to anyone who wanted to read it, even if they did not have money to purchase a copy of the book. And Leslie Feinberg was aware that because of the subject matter, the likelihood that it would appear in your local library would be very limited. So you can purchase a copy of this book. I did. I have one here. I ordered it through Leslie Feinberg's website, I believe, which you can do. They are sort of print on demand, and Leslie Feinberg had found a distributor who publishes it at cost. It says on the spine of my edition, at cost, author edition. It was Leslie Feinberg's wish after they passed away that the book should be available to anyone. And as a result, you can get a PDF of this book from Leslie Feinberg's website, and I will have a link to that website down below. You can find the PDF there. So although this is probably the most cult book on the list, it is accessible to anyone who would like to read it, as long as they can read in English, I suppose. Here is a piece of the blurb about Stone Butch Blues. Published in 1993, this brave original novel is considered to be the finest account ever written of the complexities of a transgendered existence. Woman or man? That's the question that rages like a storm around Jess Goldberg, clouding her life and her identity. Growing up differently gendered in a blue-collar town in the 1950s, coming out as a butch in the bars and factories in the pre-feminist 60s, deciding to pass as a man in order to survive when she is left without work or a community in the early 70s, this powerful, provocative, and deeply moving novel sees Jess coming full circle. She learns to accept the complexities of being a transgendered person in a world demanding simple expectations, a he-she emerging whole, weathering the turbulence. Should be a very interesting book to read as part of a group as well. And it is copyright 1993, so that gives you a sense of when this was published. Obviously, a lot has changed in terms of our understanding of the transgender experience and our acceptance, or, you know, a lot of pushback to the transgender experience since then. So it would be very interesting to read this groundbreaking book about gender identity and gender expression. It seems semi-autobiographical, but in a fictional form. That was the selection for June. So again, we take July off, and then we pick up in August with a selection from Jen, which is The Gallery by John Horne Burns. I have this New York Review of Books edition of it. So interestingly, the path that this book took to appearing as part of this Queer TBR Tackle is I found out about it when I was reading a completely different book called Leading Men by Christopher Castellani. That book is about Tennessee Williams and Tennessee Williams' lover. They go to Italy, and while they are in Italy, they meet an author named John Horne Burns. And I actually ended up not finishing the book Leading Men. I didn't like it very much. But I discovered that John Horne Burns was a real author. And as soon as I did, I ordered myself a copy of this book because I had never heard of him before. I had never heard of the book before, and the premise of this book sounds fascinating. It's a sort of forgotten queer classic. And I think when I read you the description of the book, you will understand why it sounded so appealing. John Horne Burns brought the gallery back from World War II, and on publication in 1947, it became a critically acclaimed bestseller. However, Burns's early death at the age of 36 led to the subsequent neglect of this searching book, which captures the shock of the war dealt to the preconceptions and ideals of the victorious Americans. Set in occupied Naples in 1944, the gallery takes its name from the Galleria Umberto, a bombed-out arcade where everybody in town came together in pursuit of food, drink, sex, money, and oblivion. A daring and enduring novel, one of the first to look directly at gay life in the military. I mean, like, alarm bells flashing, catching my interest at that point. The gallery poignantly conveys the mixed feelings of the men and women who fought the war that made America a superpower. So I talked about this book in a video when I think I did it in a book haul about it. And Jen saw that and added it to hers. And this is the difference between her TBR and mine. A book that I have discovered and wanted to read since I've been on BookTube is not old enough on my TBR to be featured in this challenge, but it is for Jen. But anyway, that means it occupies a really interesting place in this list because this is a collaboration between Jen and I, and there was a sort of accidental collaboration between Jen and I in this ending up on her TBR in the first place. So that is The Gallery by John Horne Burns. And again, that is the selection for the month of August. We take September off and we pick up in October with a selection of mine. This is the book that has been on my TBR the longest, at least the queer book that has been on my TBR the longest. It's Tales of the City by Armistead Maupin. This is one of the most well-known queer classic pieces of literature out there. I saw the miniseries adaptation of it in the 90s at some point, somewhere around 1994 or 1995. I was young at the time, depending on when it was. I was in my early teens. And I always wanted to read the book. But for a long time, I didn't. And part of that was that I was sort of struggling with my own sexuality and identifying myself as such. So I was worried that if I was seen reading this book, that people would sort of identify me and who I am. And I was too afraid of that. So I sort of wanted to read it, but kept pushing it away and pushing it away and pushing it away. And as a result, once I finally came out, when I was deciding to come out, I reached for a lot of classic queer literature, but I went for books that were older than this one, which was published in serial form in the 1970s. That's a really interesting thing about it. It was published in a newspaper in San Francisco in installments, and it will be really interesting to see how that works in novel form. I reached for books that were older, and then I decided to come out, and I just never circled back to this. There was even a recent sort of update of the TV show. There was one season. They really messed with the chronology of the characters because the 1990-something miniseries was set in the 1970s. And then the new series on Netflix is set in the present, but they brought back the actors from the miniseries in a lot of cases. And if you do the math on how old they would be in the present day, that does not work. But that's fine. It's fine. Anyway, this is the story of residents living in an apartment complex on 28 Barbary Lane in San Francisco. It is also about just San Francisco society at the time. There are a lot of queer characters in this book. There are characters who play with gender identity. There's famously a transgender character in this book. There are straight characters as well. It will be an interesting book to look at as part of this TBR Tackle. So that is the selection for October. We take November off, and then we pick up with the only book that I do not own a copy of, The Friendly Young Ladies by Mary Renault. This was a selection of Jen's. And again, it's interesting, the corollaries between her list and my list, because I have wanted to read a book by Mary Renault for a couple of years now and didn't really know where to go. I think most people seem to point to a book called The Charioteers. I think that's the title of it. The other interesting thing is that Mary Renault seems to be much less known in the United States than she is in the UK. And as a result, it's a little difficult to track down copies of her books in the United States. You're not likely to find them if you walk into a bookstore. Your library probably doesn't have a copy. There are not many used copies available online. So you really have to specifically seek out her work. And the good thing about this is that I took a peek online, and there are some affordable books, versions of this online, that would be used, but they don't look like they're in good condition. They're in sort of acceptable or good condition, and I prefer to buy a used book that is in fine or like new condition. But since this is the December selection, I have so much time to try to find a copy that will be both affordable and in good condition. So that is what I am going to do. And I am excited to read my first book by Mary Renault. Here is the description. Set in 1937, The Friendly Young Ladies is a romantic comedy of off-Bloomsbury Bohemia. Sheltered, naive, and just 18, Elsie leaves the stifling environment of her parents' home in Cornwall to seek out her sister, Leo, who had run away 9 years earlier. She finds Leo sharing a houseboat and a bed with a beautiful, fair-haired Helen. While Elsie's arrival seems innocent enough, it is the first of a series of events that will turn Helen and Leo's contented life inside out. Soon, a randy young doctor is chasing after all three women at once, a neighborly friendship begins to show an erotic tinge, and long, quiet ghosts from Leo's past begin to surface. Before long, no one is sure just who feels what for whom. Mary Renault wrote this delightfully provocative novel in the early 1940s, creating characters that are lighthearted, charming, and free-spirited, partly in answer to the despair characteristic of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, or Lillian Hellman's The Children's Hour. The result is a witty and stylish story that offers exceptional insight into the world of upcoming writers and artists of 1930s London, chronicling their rejection of society's established sexual mores and their heroic pursuits of art and life. It sounds fascinating to me. Really looking forward to getting a copy of this book and reading it in the month of December. So again, I would love to hear what books have been on your TBR for the longest that are queer as well, whether or not you would like to do a video about it and either use the hashtag Queer TBR Tackle or tag Jen and I, or Jen or I, in the video. You could post your list on Instagram. You could reach out to us on Instagram. I'm not really on Twitter anymore, and I don't believe Jen is either. But we would love to hear what books are on your list. If you decide to create one, you can feel free to follow along with us. We would love it if you would. But if you would like to use this as inspiration for your own list, please let us know what is on your list. I think that covers everything. I hope you will join in. Again, there will be information about how to do that down below. And I will leave it at that. As always, I really appreciate your time. I'm really looking forward to doing this in 2023, and I hope you are as well. And as always, I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.